There are names that history has remembered with honor, and others it has buried under the weight of judgment. Among the disciples of Jesus, there were fishermen, tax collectors, dreamers, and martyrs. Each one left a different mark on the history of faith. But there was one, only one, who was remembered for a single word: doubt. His name was Thomas. For 3 years, he walked beside Jesus. He saw him heal the sick, feed multitudes, calm storms with a single word. He heard from his own lips parables that transformed the soul and promises of a kingdom not of this world. But he also saw him die. He saw him fall beneath the weight of a cross, nailed between pain and darkness until everything seemed to end. When the Master breathed his last breath, something inside Thomas died with him. That's why, when the other disciples ran to tell him that Jesus had risen, his heart couldn't believe it. Not because he didn't love his Lord, but because his faith was broken. His soul was still in mourning, and so he spoke the words that would mark his name for centuries. "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger into his side, I will not believe." From that day on, they called him Doubting Thomas. He was pointed out as an example of weakness, of lack of faith. But what if his doubt wasn't a sin? What if his story wasn't about disbelief, but about the human need to understand, to touch the divine with the trembling hands of hope? Perhaps Thomas didn't doubt Jesus. Perhaps he doubted himself, his own heart, his capacity to believe after losing everything. Sometimes doubt isn't born from rejection, but from love. And in that desperate search for proof, Thomas wasn't moving away from God. He was trying to find him. Because while the others were content to hear that Christ had risen, he needed to see, to feel, to make sure that the pain hadn't been in vain. This isn't the story of a man without faith. It's the story of a man who loved his master so much that he couldn't accept his absence. Of someone who wasn't satisfied with stories but wanted to look God in the eyes, even at the risk of being misunderstood. Thomas wasn't the apostle who doubted the Son of God. He was the man who dared to seek him in the shadows of silence. And that search, that apparent weakness, would become one of the greatest proofs of love ever told in the gospel. Because sometimes, only those who dare to doubt end up finding a faith that cannot be destroyed. They say that each disciple represented a different part of the human soul. Peter was strength, John love, Judas the shadow of the heart, and Thomas was the mind that seeks to understand what the soul feels. From the beginning, he was different. He didn't talk much, but he observed every gesture, every look from Jesus. He wasn't carried away by emotion, but by the truth he could touch. He was analytical, profound, silent. While others celebrated the miracles, Thomas asked why Jesus chose to heal some and not others. When the Master spoke of the kingdom of heaven, Thomas looked up at the sky with the serene doubt of someone who longs to understand the incomprehensible. Some saw him as a cold man, but in reality, he was a heart that needed to understand before it could believe. And it was precisely because of that Jesus loved him. Because in the midst of a group of men who still didn't fully understand who he was, Thomas didn't pretend. He didn't fake faith, he sought it. He didn't repeat words, he wanted to feel their truth. There was a moment before the crucifixion when Jesus told them, "I am going to prepare a place for you, and you know the way." The others remained silent, but Thomas dared to ask, "Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way?" That question, so simple, revealed something profound. While the others feared seeming weak, Thomas wasn't afraid to admit that he didn't understand. And then Jesus spoke one of the most powerful phrases of all time. "I am the way, the truth, and the life." That answer was no coincidence. Jesus wasn't just teaching, he was speaking directly to Thomas. He was telling him that the path he was searching for couldn't be found with the eyes, but with the heart. And still, Thomas kept walking with his master, carrying inside him more questions than answers. Every step he took beside Jesus was a mixture of awe and fear. Fear of losing him, fear of not being worthy, fear of not understanding his mission. But behind that fear, a quiet faith was growing. A faith that wasn't content just to listen, but wanted to experience the divine. And that silent faith, that need to touch truth with his own hands, would later become the greatest lesson of all. Because when everything seemed lost, when the cross rose on the horizon and darkness covered the earth, Thomas would learn that the purest faith is not the one that never doubts, but the one that, in spite of doubt, keeps searching for God. The last week of Jesus' life was a whirlwind of promises, fear, and betrayal. The disciples didn't fully understand what was happening. The Master spoke of his death, of an inevitable sacrifice, and they looked at him in silence, like those who listen to a prophecy they don't want to believe. When Jesus was arrested, the group scattered. Fear overwhelmed them. Peter denied knowing him. John followed from a distance. And Thomas disappeared into the shadows. Not because he didn't love him, but because he couldn't bear to watch how hope was nailed to a cross. It is said that he stayed away during those days, hidden, trying to make sense of what had happened. He wondered how the story of the Son of God could have ended like that. How the man who had walked on water, who had raised the dead, could now lie motionless beneath a stone every night. He replayed Jesus' words in his mind. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And every night, he asked himself, where is that life now? His heart broke between faith and reason. He knew Jesus was real. He had seen his miracles, but death seemed stronger. And in the silence, doubt began to grow, like a wound that refuses to stop bleeding. When the other disciples ran to tell him, the Lord has risen, Thomas couldn't. It wasn't disbelief, it was pain. How could he believe again after watching everything crumble before his eyes? How could he open his heart when it was still full of wounds? And so he spoke the words time refused to forget. Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger into his side, I will not believe. It wasn't a challenge to God. It was a cry from the soul, the cry of a man who didn't want to believe in something that could break him again. Thomas wasn't doubting the power of Jesus. He was doubting his own heart, his ability to keep believing without seeing. While the others celebrated the resurrection, he remained alone, in silence. But sometimes, it's in silence that God prepares his greatest encounters. Days went by. The disciples gathered behind closed doors, still afraid of being discovered. The air was thick with uncertainty, and Thomas was still missing. His heart wavered between nostalgia and guilt. He wanted to believe them, but every word about the resurrection sounded like an impossible echo. Until one night, everything changed. The doors were locked. The lamps flickered like shadows on the walls, and suddenly a presence filled the room. There was no noise, no wind, no thunder, only a voice, soft yet eternal, saying, "Peace be with you." The disciples froze in awe. And then, among them, he appeared. Jesus. His face shone with a serenity beyond description. His hands bore the marks of the nails. His side still carried the open wound. And his eyes, filled with love, looked straight at Thomas. It wasn't Peter he called, nor John, nor Andrew. It was him, the one who doubted, the one everyone had judged. Jesus walked toward him slowly, and without a single word of reproach, he showed him his hands. Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believe. Thomas trembled. He couldn't speak. Every tear that fell was a confession. He reached out his hand, touched the wounds, and in that moment, he understood. Faith isn't always born from believing, but from being touched by love. My Lord and my God, he cried, and it was the most sincere prayer ever to leave his lips. Jesus didn't rebuke him. He didn't ask, "Why did you doubt?" He simply answered with tenderness, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have believed." But those words weren't a rebuke. They were a promise for all those who, like Thomas, still doubt. For all who keep searching for signs, answers, hope. And now I ask you, the one listening to this story, have you ever doubted your faith? Have you ever felt that God is silent when you need him most? If you've ever felt that way, write faith in the comments. Because just like Thomas, your doubts can also become the place where God speaks to you again. In that instant, something changed forever. Thomas was no longer the apostle who doubted, but the man who had touched the greatest mystery of faith. In a single gesture, his doubt became revelation. What had once been darkness turned into certainty. Because when his fingers brushed the wounds of Jesus, he understood that God's love cannot be explained, only experienced. Faith, he realized then, was not about closing one's eyes and pretending there were no questions. It was not about repeating what others said or accepting without thinking. Faith was to keep searching, even when the heart feels empty. It was to remain, even when the soul trembles. It was to touch the wounds and discover that even there, love is still alive. Jesus didn't appear to scold him. He didn't need to prove anything. He appeared to show us that doubt doesn't drive him away from us. It brings him closer. That when we don't understand, when we feel lost or weary, he doesn't reject us. He reveals himself. He lets himself be touched. That's why the story of Thomas is not one of weakness, but of courage. He was the only one brave enough to confess what everyone else felt but didn't dare to say. the only one who voiced aloud the questions the others hid behind their fear, and Jesus didn't punish him for it. He blessed him. From that day on, the words doubt and faith stopped being enemies, because Thomas proved that a faith without doubt is not faith, it's habit, and only those who dare to question what they believe can truly come to believe. Thomas's doubt opened a door that remains open for all of us, because there is no perfect faith, nor hearts without wounds. At some point, we are all Thomas. We all need to see God in the midst of our ruins, to feel His presence in the scars that still hurt. And when that happens, when we realize that God is not afraid of our questions, then doubt stops being darkness and becomes light. From that day on, Thomas was never the same. His gaze changed, his voice changed, his way of walking changed. He had touched eternity with his own hands, and nothing in this world could ever fill his soul with doubt again. Where once there was fear, now there was fire. Where once there were questions, now there was purpose. While many remembered his weakness, he chose to remember mercy. He knew he hadn't been rejected for his doubt. He had been embraced for his sincerity, and that truth transformed his life forever. Thomas understood that faith isn't about never falling, but about rising again when hope seems lost. He learned that God doesn't look for perfect believers, but for hearts that still dare to seek Him, and so began his new mission, to bring that message to those who, like him, lived in fear of not having enough faith. The ancients say that after Jesus' ascension, Thomas traveled farther than any other apostle. He crossed deserts, seas, and unknown lands. He carried the gospel to places where no one had ever heard the name of Christ. Some say he reached India, where he founded entire communities of believers, sowing the word in languages he had never spoken before. He didn't speak with eloquence, but he spoke with truth. He had no riches, but his story moved hearts. Because when he spoke of the Master, he didn't speak from books or rumors. He spoke from experience, from the heart of one who had touched him, who had seen the wounds, and found in them the reflection of the purest love. Thomas didn't preach from pride, but from his wound, and perhaps that's why his words had such power. It wasn't the testimony of the perfect, but of the redeemed. Every time someone doubted, he would smile and say, "I doubted too. And it was in my doubt that I found him." And so, the apostle who was once called unbelieving became a symbol of a faith unafraid of human fragility. A faith that doesn't deny questions, but transforms them into paths toward truth. Because doubt doesn't destroy faith, it purifies it. And the one who once walked through shadow can be the one who guides others into the light. The years passed, and the name of Thomas began to echo far beyond Jerusalem. He traveled tirelessly, crossing roads few dared to walk. In every village where fear reigned, he planted faith. In every weary face, he kindled hope. He didn't need temples or gold or titles. He carried only his story and the fire that had burned in his chest since the day he touched the wounded hands of his master. They say he reached the lands of the East, to people whose language he didn't understand, but whose souls longed for the same God. There, he spoke of a God who is not offended by doubt, but turns it into a bridge. He spoke of a Christ who doesn't condemn, but reveals himself. And thousands listened, because his words were not born from pride or duty, but from love. Thomas became a silent witness of the power of forgiveness. Where once there had been fear, there was now a voice saying, God can turn even doubt into purpose. And that voice grew, spreading, igniting hearts. With time, many began to call him the Apostle of the East. But he always said the same thing: I am nothing more than a messenger, an apostle of God. And those words were no coincidence, because all who, like him, dedicate their lives to sharing truth, to bringing light where there is darkness, are also apostles of God. You listening to this story, you are too. When you choose to believe, when you help, when in the midst of your doubts, you keep seeking his voice. The end of Thomas's life came as he had lived it, with faith and courage. It is said he was martyred for preaching the name of Jesus in distant lands, but he did not die in fear. He died in peace, the peace of one who had already seen the face of God. His final words were a prayer. Lord, I saw you once, and that will be enough for me forever. His body fell to the ground, but his message kept traveling, crossing centuries and borders, because faith born from doubt does not die with the body. It multiplies. And so, the man once called unbelieving became an eternal symbol of the apostles of God, those not born of perfection, but of encounter with the truth. They say that every path of faith passes, sooner or later, through a desert, a place where prayers seem unanswered, where the soul feels alone and the heavens fall silent. Thomas knew that desert, and it was there that he discovered that God doesn't always reveal himself through miracles, but through silences that teach. His story reminds us that faith isn't about having everything clear, but about continuing to walk even when we understand nothing. To believe isn't to never doubt. It's to keep moving forward even when the heart trembles. Every time you wonder if God hears you, every time you feel your faith weakening, remember Thomas. Remember that even the chosen ones doubted, and that Jesus himself revealed his presence in the midst of those doubts. Because he doesn't look for perfect followers, but for sincere souls. Doubt, when lived with humility, can become a prayer deeper than 1,000 words. Because behind every "I don't understand" lies an "I want to believe." And that "I want" is enough to move heaven itself. So if you've ever felt far from God, if you've ever thought your faith isn't enough, remember, you're not alone. We've all been Thomas at some point. We've all needed to see in order to believe. But like him, we can also transform doubt into faith, wounds into testimony, and silence into encounter. Perhaps that is the true miracle, that even when it's hard to believe, God keeps coming to meet us. Even when you don't see him, he's there. Even when you don't feel him, he remains. Even when you're silent, he listens. Thomas touched the wounded hands of Christ and discovered that scars can also be doors to eternity. Because in the marks of pain, God hid the language of his love. Sometimes we think that having faith means never doubting, that those who truly believe don't cry, don't break, don't waver. But the story of Thomas teaches us the opposite. It shows us that the purest faith isn't born in temples filled with light, but in the nights when we wonder if God is really there. Because faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's the decision to keep trusting even when everything seems lost. It's looking at the sky and saying, "I don't understand anything, but I still believe you're there." That is the faith God seeks, the one that holds on even when it trembles, that loves even without seeing, that trusts even without understanding. Jesus didn't reject Thomas for asking for a sign. He loved him precisely for daring to seek one, because whoever seeks, finds, and whoever asks eventually hears the voice of God in the middle of the silence. Maybe you, watching this video, are going through a moment like that. Maybe you've prayed without getting answers, waited without seeing miracles, felt your faith slipping through your fingers. But remember, what feels like distance might actually be preparation. Sometimes, when you think God is silent, he's teaching you to recognize his voice in the depths of your soul. Thomas didn't find Jesus in the temple or among the crowds. He found him in a closed room, in the midst of fear, when he least expected it. And maybe that's where you'll find him too, in silence, in your room, in your own heart. Don't be afraid to doubt. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to touch your own wounds, because there, in your scars, Christ can appear too. He's not afraid of your pain. He doesn't run from your fragility. He seeks you right there, where you feel lost, to remind you that even in doubt, you are still loved. The story of Thomas doesn't end in his doubt, but in his redemption. Because the one who once said, "Unless I see, I will not believe," ended up believing even without seeing. His life became living proof that the love of God can transform any heart, even the one that questions the most. Faith, he learned, isn't built in a day. It isn't inherited or imposed. Faith is discovered, fought for, and shaped. It's a flame that sometimes burns brightly and other times barely flickers, but it never goes out completely. Thomas understood that when he touched the wounds of Jesus, that it wasn't his strength keeping him standing, but the grace of the one who never stopped seeking him. We all carry our own wounds, our unanswered questions, our silences that ache. But even in that fragility, God keeps working. He doesn't wait for us to be perfect to come close. He doesn't need a great faith, only an open heart. And that small gesture of opening the soul is enough for the light to enter. Maybe Thomas's doubt wasn't an obstacle, but the way itself. Because in his need to see, Jesus showed him that true vision doesn't come from the eyes, but from the soul. And when you learn to look with the soul, you realize that God was always there, even in the days you thought he'd forgotten you. So when your faith feels weak, don't run. Don't punish yourself. Don't think you're disappointing God. Remember Thomas. Remember his story. Remember that even he, an apostle, had to touch in order to believe. And yet he was loved, chosen, and sent to bring light to the world. Maybe that's what God wants to remind you today. You don't need to have everything figured out to keep going. Your doubt doesn't push him away. It prepares you to find him. Centuries have passed since Thomas touched the hands of Christ. Yet his story lives on in every person who seeks to believe amid darkness. Every generation has carried its own doubts, its own wounds, its own silences, and still, God continues to appear within each of them. Maybe not with the visible marks of nails, but with subtler signs. A word, an embrace, a coincidence that doesn't feel accidental. The story of Thomas didn't stay trapped in the pages of the gospel. It repeats itself every time someone falls and rises again. Every time someone prays after a long silence. Every time someone chooses to trust, even when they can't see the way forward. And that, too, is a miracle. In this world filled with noise, hurry, and hollow faith, God is still looking for hearts like Thomas's. Honest hearts that aren't afraid to admit their fragility. Because only those who recognize their weakness can be filled with divine strength. Only those who doubt can truly believe deeply. We too are part of that story. In every act of kindness, every prayer, every tear turned into hope, we become the new apostles of God. We don't need robes or temples or titles. We only need to love even when we don't understand, to love even when silence feels endless. Thomas wasn't remembered for his mistake, but for his encounter. And that encounter is still waiting for everyone who dares to seek. Because faith isn't a summit we reach, but a path we walk, sometimes in light, sometimes in doubt, but always with the certainty that, at the end, He is waiting for us. Just as Thomas found the Master in a locked room, maybe you too will find Him in the simplest corner of your life, in a conversation, in a song, in a quiet moment. Because God doesn't reveal Himself to those who have it all figured out. He reveals Himself to those still searching. There are moments in life when our faith feels like it's fading, when praying seems pointless, when nothing changes, when God seems silent. But even that silence can be an answer. Because faith doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It doesn't always illuminate. Sometimes it teaches us to see in the dark. Thomas learned that in the most profound way, by touching the wounds. There he discovered that faith isn't about escaping pain, but about finding that even pain can become a place of encounter with God. In his trembling hands, the scars became promises, and the spilled blood became a sign of love. And if he, who walked with Jesus, who saw Him die and rise again, needed to touch to believe, how could we not need it too? Maybe our own wounds are the new marks where God wants to reveal Himself. Maybe every doubt, every tear, every fall is where He whispers, I am here. Faith doesn't live only in temples or words. It lives in the ordinary. In the forgiveness that's hard to give, in the embrace that heals, in the hope that returns when everything seemed lost. There, in the small things, God lets Himself be touched. Thomas reminds us that faith isn't a prize for those who never doubt, but a gift for those who keep seeking. It's not about seeing to believe, but about loving to see. And in the end, what truly sustains faith isn't certainty, it's presence. Maybe that's the most hidden truth of all. God doesn't hide from those who doubt. He reveals Himself in them. Maybe you, listening to this, have also been searching for answers. Maybe you've felt that your faith isn't what it used to be, that praying has become hard, or that God's silence weighs heavier than ever. But let me tell you something, you're not alone. Doubting doesn't make you less of a believer. Feeling fear doesn't make you weak. Crying doesn't mean you've lost your faith. It means you're still alive, that your heart still beats, that you still care about believing. And that already is faith. Because faith isn't always a victorious shout. Sometimes it's a tired whisper that says, God, I don't understand, but I'm still here. That's the kind of faith Thomas had. The faith that's born in darkness and blooms into hope. The faith that isn't learned from books, but from wounds. And you can have it too. You don't need to see Him. You only need the courage to keep searching. If you've ever felt like Him, lost, tired, doubting, remember that Jesus also appears in closed hearts. That He hasn't forgotten you, that He doesn't judge you, and that even in your doubt, He keeps calling your name, so don't give up. Don't let that small light inside you go out. Even if the world tells you believing makes no sense. Even if others don't understand your path, keep searching. Because the same God who revealed Himself to Thomas can also reveal Himself in your life. And when that happens, when you feel His presence again, even in silence, you'll understand that He never left you. That even in your most uncertain days, you were walking right beside Him. Because faith isn't about never doubting. Faith is about never stopping loving. Time had passed, and Thomas was no longer the young man who once walked through the fields of Galilee. His hair had turned white like the sand, and his steps had slowed, burdened more by memories than by years. He had seen distant lands, heard languages he didn't understand, and met souls who, in some mysterious way, reminded him of the same Jesus he had followed. In India, where the air smells of incense and the sun rests gently on the skin, Thomas preached more through silence than through words. He didn't need great sermons because his gaze was enough. In it, there was something people couldn't explain, a mix of tenderness and eternity, as if the light of the risen Christ still shone in his eyes. Every night before sleeping, he would look up at the sky. No one knew what he was thinking, but sometimes tears would fall slowly onto the ground. Some said he wept for his past. Others said he wept for the world. But maybe he cried because with each passing day, he felt closer to seeing him again. The people loved him. They called him the man who speaks with heaven. He healed the sick, comforted those who had lost hope, and spoke of a God who could be found even in loneliness. And though his voice was soft, every word carried the weight of eternal truth. Sometimes his companions found him praying alone by the sea, whispering words no one could fully understand. "My Lord and my God," he would repeat, again and again, with the same emotion as that first encounter. His body was frail now, but his faith burned like a torch. He knew his mission was coming to an end, yet he felt no fear, only peace, the peace of one who knows he is about to go home. One evening, as the sun sank slowly behind the mountains, Thomas asked to be alone. He said he wanted to pray before nightfall. He walked slowly, leaning on a wooden staff, up a hill covered in grass. From there, he could see the sea, the villages he had evangelized, and the faces of those who had learned to believe. The sky turned gold and orange. The air felt warm, almost sacred. Thomas knelt, closed his eyes, and let the wind caress his face. In that moment, a deep calm fell over the place. There was no sound, not a bird, not the sea, only silence. A silence so pure it seemed to hold the voice of God itself. Then, something changed in the air. A light began to spread before him, not blinding but living, soft and warm, wrapping everything around it. Thomas opened his eyes, and in his heart he knew what was happening. He had waited his whole life for this moment. With trembling voice he whispered, "My Lord, have you come for me?" The wind stopped, and from the center of that light, a voice answered. Gentle, deep, unmistakable. "Thomas." His body trembled, not in fear, but in recognition. It was him, the same Jesus he had followed, touched, and loved beyond death. Thomas looked up and saw the light take form before him. At first a glow, then a figure, growing clearer with each second. He didn't know if he was dreaming or if heaven itself had come down to earth, but the presence felt unmistakably familiar. His heart pounded. Tears mixed with the dust of the path, and in the stillness, he heard again the voice that had once calmed his soul. "Do not be afraid, Thomas." The figure drew near. It was Jesus, the same face, the same eyes that had looked at him with tenderness the day he doubted, the day he touched his hands. But now his light was different, not human, but infinite. Thomas fell to his knees. His voice barely left his throat. "My Lord and my God," he murmured, with the same devotion as that day, but with the trembling of one who knows he no longer belongs to this world. Jesus smiled, and as he extended his hand, he said softly, "You believed because you saw me. But now you will see what those who never saw me believed." Thomas closed his eyes. The air grew light around him. His body no longer felt heavy. The years no longer hurt. All that had been doubt turned to light. All that had been fear became peace. The earth seemed to fade away, and the heavens opened like a doorway. The apostle understood that the journey wasn't ending. It was just beginning. A tear rolled down his cheek, not of sadness, but of gratitude. He had touched the Son of God in life, and now with his final breath, he was seeing him once more. Jesus placed his hand on his shoulder, filling him with indescribable warmth. "Come, Thomas," he said, "for the road that began with doubt ends in truth." The apostle took one last breath, and as the light surrounded him completely, he understood his story was never about disbelief. It was about love. Those who were far away later said they saw a light on the hill, bright as dawn, and that Thomas's body rested in peace, a smile on his lips, like someone who had finally found what he'd been seeking all along. When the radiance faded, the sky returned to its calm. Those who went looking for him found Thomas kneeling on the hill, his face serene, a faint smile on his lips. There was no fear, no pain, only a peace beyond description. In his hands he still held the wooden staff that had carried him across so many roads, and on his chest rested a small wooden cross. The wind blew gently, as if nature itself wished to accompany his departure. Some said they saw a light rise slowly over the horizon, and that for an instant, the air smelled of incense and sea. No one could explain it, but everyone felt it. Something sacred had happened there. Over time, that hill became a place of pilgrimage. Men and women came from far away to pray where Thomas had prayed for the last time. They didn't come to ask for miracles, but to learn from his story, because they understood that his faith hadn't been born from certainty, but from wounds, that his strength hadn't come from never doubting, but from daring to keep searching. The disciples who had heard his message began to repeat it. Doubt doesn't destroy faith, it purifies it. And so, the voice of Thomas continued to echo through generations, traveling beyond borders and tongues, in every heart that rose after falling, in every soul that chose to believe despite the silence. Thomas lived again. The world had called him unbelieving, but God called him brave. Because while many were content to believe what others told them, he wanted to see for himself. And in doing so, he discovered what few ever understand. That the strongest faith is not the one that never doubts, but the one that doubts and still chooses to believe. Thus ended the story of Thomas, the apostle who dared to doubt the Son of God, and who because of it, came to know him more deeply than anyone. His name was written not only in the pages of the gospel, but in the soul of everyone who keeps seeking God in the midst of darkness. And every time someone utters his words, "My Lord and my God," the story begins again. Because as long as there is a heart that doubts, there will also be a heart that, like Thomas's, is about to see God face to face. As time passed, his name became a living memory. The disciples who had walked beside him told his story with reverence, as if speaking of a flame that never went out. Sometimes they told it around a fire on moonless nights, other times on dusty roads where hope seemed to fade. They said Thomas was still there, in every word, every gesture, every soul that dared to believe again. "Don't be afraid if your faith falters," his followers would say, "for even the sun hides, only to rise again." The disciples of Thomas continued his work long after his passing. They told his words in the villages, repeated his teachings on moonless nights, and every time someone doubted, they remembered his story. The seed he had planted crossed seas and centuries. Some called it the Church of the East, others simply the Faith of Thomas. But the name didn't matter, because the essence was always the same. A God who is not afraid of questions, a love that doesn't demand conditions, a light that never goes out. And so, while the world forgot names and borders, the voice of that man remained alive, not in temples or books, but in the souls that learned that doubt can also be an act of faith. Even today, when someone looks up to the sky searching for answers, without realizing it, they repeat his gesture. When someone dares to believe again after falling, they walk the same path he once did. Because the spirit of Thomas didn't die on the hill where he departed. It stayed among us, reminding us that the greatest faith doesn't belong to those who never doubt, but to those who keep believing even when they tremble. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, it seems as if his voice still whispers, "My Lord and my God." That phrase, so simple and so immense, has crossed through time. It was born from the lips of a man who doubted, and today, it has become one of the most powerful confessions of faith in all history. Thomas believed when he touched the wounds of Jesus, but we believe when we touch our own. And in every wound, in every loss, in every attempt to rise again, he reveals himself, not as a miracle, but as presence. Perhaps that was the secret Thomas wanted to leave us before he departed. That there is no distance between heaven and earth when a soul dares to believe. That closed doors cannot keep God out, and that hands which once trembled in fear can now rise in prayer. Stories don't end when men die. They end when their voices stop being heard. But the story of Thomas is still alive. Every time someone chooses to believe again after doubt, every time a tired heart dares to pray once more, the echo of his voice resounds somewhere within the human soul. Because faith isn't the absence of darkness. It's the courage to keep lighting a small flame within it. It's rising again when silence feels endless. It's trusting even when you don't understand why. And if you've come this far, it's no coincidence. Maybe this video isn't just another story, it's an answer. Maybe these words have touched something that's been asleep inside you. If so, don't leave in silence. Jesus once said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And that path didn't end at the cross. It continues, in you, in me, in everyone who rises again, who forgives, who keeps believing even when the world says it makes no sense. So don't hide your light. Don't silence your questions. Don't be afraid to seek God, even when you don't understand his answers. Because in the end, the same Jesus who called Thomas by name also knows yours, and maybe you can't see him now, but when you least expect it, you'll hear his voice whispering the same words he once said to him, "Do not be afraid. I am still here." They say that after touching the wounds of Christ, Thomas fell to his knees and never looked at the world the same way again. From that moment on, every sunrise reminded him of a truth the world couldn't understand. That the love of God isn't seen with the eyes, but with the soul. He understood it when his fingers brushed the scars of the Master, and realized those marks weren't signs of defeat, but of victory, because true love leaves traces, and the marks of Christ still shine, even in the dark. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's the message Jesus wanted to leave for Thomas, and for all of us. That when doubt embraces you, don't run. When fear paralyzes you, don't hide, because even behind closed doors, he still enters. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Those words weren't a condemnation. They were a promise for you, the one listening now. Because even if you don't see him, he is still here. Even if you think you're alone, he's still knocking at the door of your heart. And if today you hear his voice, don't ignore it. The world will try to convince you that faith is weakness, that believing means losing control, that trusting in God is closing your eyes. But Thomas showed us the opposite. Faith is daring to look straight at the truth, even when it hurts. It's reaching out your hand and saying, "Show me your wounds, Lord, so that in them I may recognize my own." And when you do, you'll feel it. Not with your eyes, but with your soul. You'll feel the peace Thomas felt when Jesus said his name. The same peace that still waits for everyone who chooses to believe, even through tears. So before you leave, keep this in your heart. God isn't afraid of your questions. He doesn't turn away from your doubts. He seeks you within them. Because sometimes, the place where you think you've lost him is exactly where you'll find him again. And if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that your faith is still alive, subscribe to this channel. Not to follow content, but to keep walking together. Because here, we don't tell stories to hear and forget. We tell them to awaken what was asleep in the soul. Welcome to Apostles of God, where every word, every silence, and every story brings us a little closer to the invisible face of love. And remember, the world may forget your name, but it will never forget the faith of the one who, even while doubting, still believed.